Hello and greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Haroon Sidat, and I would like to welcome you all to our podcast series. It's part of our Legacies of Learning project at the Islam UK Centre here at Cardiff University. This project is generously funded by the Jameel Educational Foundation, and we are delighted that you have tuned in to our new series. Education, pedagogy, and learning have been subjects of detailed discussions by Muslim authors from the early Islamic period to this very day. Our Legacies of Learning project draws on a range of historical sources in Islamic tradition in order to investigate notions of learning and knowledge production in the medieval and early modern Islamic world. You can find more information on our website, where we will provide the link at the end of this video. In this series, we talk to leading academics who are exploring the Islamic intellectual tradition and who can help us explore the potential educational implications and applications of this tradition in the contemporary period. Today, we are delighted to have Professor Asad Ahmed, who is a Magistrate Distinguished Professor of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures and Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. That's a lot to say. And affiliate faculty in the Department of Philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. His focus is on early Islamic social history and pre modern Islamic intellectual history, with a special focus on the rationalist disciplines such as philosophy, logic, legal theories, and astronomy. His latest book, published in 2022, which is going to be the focus of our discussion today, Palimpsests of Themselves, Logic and Commentary in the Postclassical Muslim South Asia, is a study of a book called Sullam al-ʿulūm, which is translated as the Ladder of the Sciences by Muḥibballāh al-Bihārī, who died in 1119 or 1707 of the Common Era. And the book is long considered to be the most advanced logic textbook in the Indian Niẓāmī curriculum. Professor Asad, welcome. We're honored to have you, and welcome to our podcast. If I could begin for our viewers, could you set the scene regarding the Islamic history of, or the history of Islamic philosophy in North India and its reception into the areas of learning and society?
Great. Let me begin by thanking you, Dr. Siddharth, for this wonderful honor. And I think it may be the first one inaugurating your podcast. I'm not sure, but if that's the case, I'm even more honored and not so deserving of this great gesture on your part. But thank you. And I also want to thank you for starting this important podcast and for the kinds of work that you are doing through Cardiff and through your center. So, no, I'm very happy to talk about the book, and let's in fact begin with the question you've asked because it's rather appropriate. We're trying to situate Islamic philosophy in its larger context. So, philosophy in the Islamic world comes via a major translation activity from the Greek and Syriac sources mainly. There are other sources that are also translated into Arabic, such as sources from Pahlavi and through Sanskrit and other languages. But the main conduits into the Islamic tradition come from Greek and Syriac. Already during the first dynasty of Islam, the Umayyads, that ruled from 661 to 749, there is some translation activity that is mentioned in the sources. Texts from this period generally tend to relate to administrative and practical matters. Some texts on agriculture even are reported, and fragments of them do exist. And there are also texts from occult disciplines such as alchemy that were patronized by the Umayyads at this time. But the activity, the translation activity in earnest, begins with the coming of the second dynasty of Islam, the Umayyads. Um, so this, I mean, there have been questions raised about why and how this translation activity takes place and how it influences the development of Islamic philosophy itself. I think the most convincing and compelling thesis about the reasons underlying this translation activity comes from Dimitri Gutas. And to put it in simple terms, he explains that even before the coming of Islam, there is a particular ideology of the Sassanids, this large empire to the northeast of Arabia, where the effort was to gather together different bodies of knowledge uh, and bring it back into the fold of the languages and traditions of the Sassanids. The argument was that the knowledge had been dispersed from the holy texts of the Sassanids themselves, and the translation was meant to bring it back into that fold. So when the Abbasids come to power, quite a bit of their support actually comes from the eastern provinces of Islam. And you might recall that it's not so long ago that the eastern provinces had memories of their belonging and identity with the Sassanid Empire. Many of the administrators in the empire are actually former administrators of the Sassanids, for example, and there are a number of families that are invested in carrying forward the memories and ideologies of the Sassanids. So it's in that context that a large translation activity as a kind of a continuation of the legacy and legitimization of the Abbasids begins to take place. And then it takes hold within the Islamic world and becomes a major facet of its identity, informing theology, legal theory, law, and a number of other disciplines along the way. Uh, so, just to finish off the story, I know I've spoken quite a bit. I mean, the answer is supposed to be long because it's a very important and complex series of things that takes place. But to bring it closer to the Islamic tradition, initially the philosophical works are taught and translated by circles of translators themselves, and they generally tend to be Christians. And some of the students of Muslim philosophers also Christian in the early period. These Christians who were considered to be heterodox by the Byzantine Empire had generally maintained a curriculum that included philosophy and, generally speaking, Greek works and their translations into Syriac in a kind of a cosmopolis that was afforded by the Sassanid Empire. So some of the earliest Muslim philosophers, as I mentioned, are students of these translator philosophers, but very, very quickly, starting already in the ninth century, philosophy in the Islamic world begins to take its own directions. Going well beyond exegetical exercises and commentaries towards synthesis and critique and innovation. So, you begin to hear very quickly already in the ninth century names of philosophers like Kindi, and then onward Farabi and the famous Avicenna that we'll learn more about going forward. The initial centers of learning are in generally the hub of the translation, which is Baghdad. But then it moves forward both eastward and westward throughout the Muslim empire, which we know also expands very, very quickly, almost miraculously. So its western provinces, such as the Iberian Peninsula, are represented later on in the 11th and 12th century by figures like Ibn Bajjah and Ibn Rushd, and they become the Avampace and the Averroes of the Latin West, and their works are translated into Latin and inform the Western philosophical tradition and the Christian scholastic tradition. And the other part of it then is carried forward through the legacy of the famous Avicenna, who dies in 1037. And his legacy, of course, is important throughout the Muslim empire and provides a shared space of discourse, but especially in the eastern part of the Muslim empire, his legacy informs the work done by philosophers at Maragha, for example, supported by the Mongols, and through the patronage of the Timurids, his legacy is carried forward into South Asia, and then with the Safavids into the Iranian world and so on. So that's a very quick rundown of how philosophy came in the Islamic world and how it spread. And I'll be happy to say more as you ask more questions.
Yeah. I also want to then move to how it found its way into places like India or Hindustan. How was the reception into areas of learning and society there?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. The answer is can be presented in simple terms. In my response to your first question, I was alluding to the spread of philosophy uh, in the Islamic East, in the Safavid world, for example. There is a period of the production of textbooks after the synthesis of Avicenna and critiques following that synthesis in the late 11th and 12th centuries. In the 13th century, there's a massive production of various kinds of textbooks in philosophy and logic and theology. And in the 14th and 15th century, these textbooks then become themselves spaces of dialectic and dispute through commentaries. Part of that tradition is received into the Safavid world in the 16th century. And there are well-known figures in that world. Late 15th century, we have a figure like Dawani, who of course precedes the Safavids. But then, of course, there are his rivals, the Dashraki, father and son. So the tradition of especially the Dashtakis and the kinds of contributions they make in conversation with Dawani, that informs the legacy of philosophy and logic in the South Asian context. So a number of students and texts from that tradition of the Safavid world migrates into North India, especially in the context of a changing political scene. The Safavids, of course, come forward not just as the political heirs of a former tradition, but also producing a new theological dispensation for that region of the Islamic world. So there are a number of scholars and their students who, because of these changing circumstances, begin to migrate in large numbers into North India, many of them getting patronage from the Mughals, from emperors and administrators, and ultimately, by the late 17th century, forming a network of scholarship called the Farangi Mahal that situates itself in North India. It finds ultimately its roots and continuation in the city of Lucknow. There's still, in fact, to this day, scholars from that tradition who reside in Lucknow. Some of them are good friends of mine, and they have maintained a level of scholarly activity related to the rationalist disciplines going back into that legacy. So that is the starting point. That is how it comes and situates itself in North India. Philosophy and logic, although in the Islamic world in South Asia does spread throughout the region, it does remain, generally speaking, I would say, that the bulk and density of it generally remains in the North Indian space. It's a North Indian affair. And there are other, of course, scholarly traditions in South Asia, such as the tradition of Shah Waliullah, which is through another madrasa system, the Madrasa Rahimiyya, established by his father, which focuses on, although it does study the rationalist disciplines, its focus is distinctly the manqulat, the transmitted disciplines, especially focus on hadith, new theological positions introduced by Shah Waliullah in his Hujja Baligha and other works. So there are distinct traditions, they overlap, they work with each other, but the rationalist disciplines, philosophy, logic, and so on, comes from the Safavid world into North India.
Thank you. I'm also interested because, as we know, India is quite a multilingual environment. So I wonder how much that facilitated or how much of an impact that logic and philosophy might have had at this time. So, kind of looking at it from the reception of it in those parts of the world.
Yeah, this is something that I have often wondered about, but I have not been able to find the kinds of evidence I wish I had found. Logic and philosophy and kalam in India is generally produced in the Arabic language. So, although there may be scholars whose vernacular languages may be different, or who may, of course, who in fact most of them also were masters of Persian, their output and conversations and disputes in these disciplines are bounded by the linguistic community of Arabic, scholarly Arabic. And that's interesting because, I mean, of course, there are also local traditions of philosophy in South Asia that are already present, like Nyaya, for example, so traditions in Sanskrit. But I have found, surprisingly enough, in the field of logic and largely in the field of disciplines such as physics, no interaction among these different linguistic scholarly communities. Overlaps do take place in matters related to metaphysics, for example, or philosophical Sufism with Indic traditions. Um, but somehow the space of logic, especially, and falsafa, especially, remains confined to the Arabic linguistic community and does not seem to receive or to go outside of those spaces into other linguistic or denominational communities.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on to your book, Palimpsests of Themselves, Logic and Commentary in the Post-Classical Muslim South Asia. And I want you to tell me about the book itself, how it came about, why did you write about it, what motivated you to write about it?
Right, thank you. This book, the Sullam al-ʿulūm of Muḥibballāh falls within the tradition of other logic books. So the story of the study of logic in the post-Avicennan period is a story that begins really with the work of Najmuddin al-Katibi, the work called Shamsiyya, and its commentary by Tahtani, which is paired with it in reading and writing practices. And that work itself is something that comes out of a long disputation culture over the contributions made by Avicenna. So after Avicenna, there are lots of critiques and debates about his positions on various disciplines, such as logic and philosophy, including metaphysics and physics and so on. And a number of these textbooks emerged in the 13th century. So Katabi's text, the Shamsiyya, is one of them. There's another text called the Matali of Urmavi, which also includes a large text section on logic. These two texts produce, they agitate commentarial work. In other words, further disputation about them in the 14th century and 15th century. And then during this period, there are other similar, post-disputation logic textbooks that are produced, such as the Tahdhib al-Mantiq of Taftazani. So the Sullam al-ʿulūm is in line with this kind of a tradition of disputation culture, production of a short and pithy textbook, a matan, further disputation and commentary, and so on. It's of interest to me because it's one of the last texts produced in that kind of a cycle. That's the first, an initial intrigue that it had for me. What has happened by the end of this or later period of this work happening in logic? But the other thing that I found to be exciting about it is that this text is doing something deceptive. It is certainly a traditional text of logic. It's recognizably so. Its arrangement and chapter themes and so on are something you can map onto other texts like the Tahdhib al-Mantiq of Taftazani and the Shamsiyya of Katabi. But at the same time, it is rather heavily filled with metaphysical questions. In other words, the author is dealing with basic questions of logic through questions of metaphysics, but it's doing so within the format of a logic work. And these questions of metaphysics complicate usually basic positions that we have in the field of logic that have been established through these textbooks and disputations cultures. Sometimes it raises, the text, the Sullam raises second order questions about basic principles of logic, such as the correspondence theory of truth, which is debated through the liar paradox in that work. Now, these questions that I mentioned, these issues of metaphysics had already, of course, been raised in earlier sources in the tradition. But the Sullam's main project for me appears to be, to reflect on these higher order challenges in the context of the traditional textbook. So that was my initial pull towards this book. It's a late book, it's an advanced book. It is one that forces the commentators not just to go to other logic textbooks, but also to books of kalam and metaphysics, and to deal with internal problems and inconsistencies of the field of logic through a lens of metaphysics and kalam and so on.
Okay, thank you. So you've talked about what motivated you to write the book, but I'm also interested about the author. What may have motivated him to write this work, and how was he supported? How was he funded? Because patronage is an interest of many of us in terms of being able to write our works and do our teaching and everything else. So I wondered if you could shed some light on that, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the author, we don't know all that much about him, right? Muḥibballāh Bihārī, he was, born in a dependency of Muḥibballāh in Bihar, which is one of the provinces of India. And he's a Hanafi jurist, and initially begins to gain fame because of his legal scholarship under the reign of Aurangzeb, who dies in the same year as Muḥibballāh al-Bihārī. And then under his patronage, he serves as a qadi of Lucknow and Hyderabad at one point, and also is later appointed as a private tutor for the emperor's grandson, Rafi al-Qadr. And we don't know much more about his life. So in terms of, and he has, of course, patronage. He's appointed qadi. He's traveling with the emperor to various places. At one point, he also goes to Kabul, which is one of the sort of farthest extent of the Mughal Empire at this time. He is also in the lineage of the Farangi Mahal, whom I mentioned. So he is, one of the students of the founding father of the tradition. So those are the things we know about him. What motivated him to write this particular type of work, I can only speculate on, because he is, of course, a figure who was operating in the second half of the 17th century. And it is during this period that we have an interesting set of philosophical and metaphysical questions that are being raised in debate cultures. For example, this is the period of the famous Shams-e-Bazigha, or Shams al-Bazigha, of Mahmud Jaunpuri, who is critiquing the famous Mir Damad and his innovations in the field of philosophy. And these kinds of dialectics also filtering through another figure, Muḥibballāh al-Allahabadi, and Sialkoti. All these figures in 17th century South Asia are producing new and innovative ways in a dialectical space of thinking about philosophy and metaphysics. So Muḥibballāh al-Bihārī, the author of Sullam al-ʿulūm, uh, emerges towards the second half of the period of this dialectical culture and innovation in philosophy in South Asia in the 17th century. And I think this is what motivates him to write. These kinds of disputes and discussions and subjects are what motivate him to write a logic work of the sort that we find in the Sullam. That is speculation on my part, but I think it's a relatively well-educated guess as to why he produces this book.
You mentioned that he traveled, and I'm always fascinated by this whole genre of rihla fi talab al-ilm, traveling to seek knowledge. Um, why might this be? I mean, I just want you to kind of explain a little bit more why you think this might be important for learning in particular, this idea of traveling.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, even I've noticed that in various contexts within the study of Islam, but of course certainly with South Asia too, that scholars, to gain different kinds of expertise in different disciplines, travel from one region to another and from one scholar to another, including those scholars who may be in a rival camp. So often, the Farangi Mahal scholars or Farangi Mahalli scholars, those in other words associated with that family, are pitted against the tradition of Shah Waliullah, who are scholars known generally for the promotion of hadith. But that said, one often finds not just intellectual collaborations between the two sides, supposed rival sides, but also even kinship ties. People get married into those distinct families. The Farangi Mahalli families do get married into the Shah Waliullah camp along the way. So I think the main reason for such travel is to gain expertise from the masters of a particular discipline. So if you're going to study hadith, which the Farangi Mahalli did, they're not really known as scholars of hadith and manqulat, but they did write, for example, commentaries on the Jami of Tirmidhi. They did write fatwa. They were appointed jurists and qudat. So they, of course, have this broader training, and they're quite adept at it. They're not known for that kind of production, right? They're known for writing in the fields of logic and falsafa and kalam and things like that. But they have, of course, extensive and deep training of other disciplines. So in order to gain that expertise, they would travel from one region to another to study with this master of the craft and another. They studied medicine as well. So they would go to the famous families like the Sharifi family or their students, those tied to the Sharifis to study medicine. They would go normally to students of the Shah Waliullah line to study hadith with them. The rationalist disciplines, of course, they themselves capture, so they study that among themselves. So this is the main reason for moving about in different regions and spaces.
Thank you. Your title of your book is very, very interesting. Palimpsests of Themselves. What is a palimpsest?
Sure. A palimpsest, in a literal sense, is a piece of writing, normally a parchment, that has layers of writing upon it. So, for example, you may have writing in Greek on a parchment or papyrus that material is recirculated for another piece of writing. So let's say when it has served its purpose, it's whitewashed, and then Arabic is written on it at a later period, even 200 years later. And then when that has served its purpose, it's whitewashed, another layer, let's say a Latin piece of writing or another Arabic piece of writing. And there are some famous palimpsests that we can even know by name now, like the Sana palimpsest, which is a Quran fragment. Modern technology allows you these days to look beyond the latest layer into the earlier layers and see what was written, beneath the palimpsest. It also tells you something about material culture and how objects are being moved from one location to another and from one culture to another. So literally, that's what a palimpsest is. Palimpsests usually don't have the writings that are written on it. The different layers don't have a relationship with each other. They're just independent. It just so happens that the substrate is moving from one place to the other, but the formal aspects of it, the form on that substrate, is not related to another form on it. So I was using the word palimpsest as a metaphor for what is happening in commentarial writing in the Islamic tradition. And I call the book Palimpsests of Themselves. And the idea here is that the later commentarial layers, one commentary and then a super commentary, another commentary upon it, and of course, underlying all of it is a matan, a base text. Each layer is not only agentive and has a kind of independent authority and innovation, but is also voicing the concerns as agitated by those concerns of an earlier layer. So a matan, for example, has embedded within it, a base text has embedded within it certain hints and clues and allusions which guide the later commentator into finding solutions which the matan already knows and is aware of, but it's creating a certain kind of a scholarly agitation and exercise in the next layer of writing, so that the matan itself in the future does not disappear or become irrelevant. It's making itself relevant through this kind of interesting mechanism of allusions and hints, the next layer. And the next layer does the same thing. So in that sense, each layer is a palimpsest of itself, right? It's a layer of its own self in a future incarnation in the voice of a different person, but is projecting its own voice through that new person. Now, that new person has his own project, own philosophical positions, which also come through, even as it voices the lower later as agitated by it, and then it continues the same exercise in the next generation. So that's how they're palimpsests of themselves, because the book is also a theory of commentarial writing in the Islamic tradition. I produced the theory through the lens of this text, the Sullam al-ʿulūm, and its commentarial tradition. So I hope that's helpful.
No, it's very useful, which nicely leads into my next question, is that in your book, you mentioned that he wrote a commentary on his own book. And I wondered if you could, I mean, many of us are used to commentaries, shuruhat, as we call them. But I wondered if you could explain why he might have done this and what that actually means, what a commentary actually means for scholars.
Yeah, so as far as self-commentary is concerned, obviously they serve various purposes. A mutton may be something sometimes in the form of simple notes, pithy statements that an author has that he uses in a teaching circle. So a self-commentary is meant to fill that out. That's one purpose it can serve. In the kind of text that we're dealing with, the Sullam, those kinds of texts, a self commentary is meant to give signposts that are found in the base text itself. So the base text would know the answer or the proof of a particular claim that it's making or certain problem it's trying to solve, but it would not offer it to the reader. It expects the reader, the next commentator, whose engagement with the text is a writerly engagement, not necessarily a passive readerly engagement or a readerly engagement that leads from one text to the other. What they want is the commentator to write upon the text. So a self commentary, in that same sense, is something to which the underlying text, the base text, leads the commentator so that he may receive hints from that self commentary and then patch certain things through that self commentary into an earlier tradition or into other parts of the base text to produce economical answers and proofs, even critiques of the base text itself. So that's the kind of function that the self commentary of Bihārī, the Sullam al-ūlūm's author, seems to serve. And there are similar things, for example, the commentaries on the Manar in the Usul fiqh tradition, they generally seem to have this kind of an approach um, to writing and writing self commentaries.
Yeah, so that leads into another question. I'm going to try and combine some of the questions. So I do apologize for that if it seems like asking a number of questions in one go. Um, about a commentary genre, I find it really fascinating. And you mentioned that commentaries in your book, you mentioned that commentaries were were meant to be less read and more written. I think that's kind of what you were saying. But also you mentioned something about the hypotext, which is the matan and the shar, was deliberately elusive and elusive, which is what you've just kind of mentioned. And you talk about its future, it calls upon future hypertext to actualize it. Um, I was when I was reading this, I couldn't help but thinking that is this a form of devotional act? So I wondered if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by less to be read and more to be written, and maybe perhaps my musing on the idea that it might be a form of devotion here.
Yeah, I don't. Thank you for that. Did not use the word devotional act in the book, but that is a nice expression to think about the phenomenon. So let me first uh, yeah, address the first point. When I say that a commentary was meant to be written or part of a writerly culture and not to be read, by that I mean that the author of any text that is an underlying text for another text, which we call a hypotext, the author of any hypotext realizes that a mere reading of the text is not going to make that text effective or meaningful in the future. Readership will, uh, you know, will decrease. It will diminish. The life of a text in these pre-print cultures is sustained by the writing that is done upon it. So I have actually a very nice example of this from the Sullam tradition. There are, of course, a number of commentaries. I will see in the book something like about 100 commentaries and super commentaries that are written on the text. So it's a very popular text. And in the opening lines, the author, Muḥibballāh al-Bihārī, has a supplication to God. And he says, O Lord, make this text in its fame like the sun among the stars. And he leaves it at that. And one of his commentators, Mullah Mubin, who's a 19th century figure, dies in the 19th century, he says that, well, what Muḥibballāh Bihārī means through the supplication is to say that God should make his text famous. And the wish was granted in the sense that people wrote commentaries on it, and other texts in comparison to it came to be obscured. So the point he's making there is that the obscurity of a text, its death lies in the fact that nobody's writing commentaries on it. Right? So to be a bestseller is in that tradition is to be a text that uh, forces people to engage in commentarial writing. Now, Mullah Mubin himself, whose commentary I just mentioned, they wrote a really lucid commentary on the Sullam al-ʿulūm. Yeah, this commentary itself becomes the foundation for my commentarial exercise on the text in my commentary and my translation. But it is such a clear and lucid commentary in the sense that he doesn't use the same kinds of mechanisms for the production of writing upon his own commentary. That the manuscript witnesses of this text are relatively few in South Asia. It does get absorbed into print culture later on, but writing on it is limited. And there is an oft-repeated pun that is found in the tradition about Muḥibballāh al-Bihārī, sorry, about Mullah Mubin, right? So Mubin, of course, means clear, and it's also his name and the name of his text. So people in the scholars in the Madrasa tradition would tell their students, Mubin Rama bin Shun Mubin, right? So don't read Mubin, the author, because it is too Mubin, too clear, right? So you don't want necessarily to read base texts or commentaries that say everything, because your own tazkiyat al-adhan, your own sharpening of the wit, your own scholarly movement is hampered by such texts, and commentaries are not written on those texts, so they sort of become irrelevant. So that's what I mean by commentary being a writerly tradition. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, really interesting because, in a madrasa tradition, when I was in madrasa, there was a strong emphasis on making sure not only that you knew Arabic very well, but you were able to unlock texts. Some texts are very, very mubham, they're very vague, or they're almost like linguistic puzzles. You kind of have to kind of work out what's going on. So that's when I read those passages in your book, it reminded me of my own experience, which I found which were difficult at the time, but I found it very useful now because I find it I can unlock text now much more easily. Um, Here's a controversial question. Sorry, go on. You were going to say something.
The Mubham texts are made deliberately so by the author, and the author gives sufficient allusions and hints to lead the student. So even when the author is dead, uh, he's not really dead. He's present as a master in the text, guiding you through these allusions and hints to different other texts or different parts of his own text, different commentarial exercises that are horizontal, almost as a constant presence. So mutala'a, or deep reading, which is an important facet of Islamic learning after a certain period, as discussed by Khalid Darwehib, is certainly important, but it includes also the mechanism through which the mutala may be actualized. And this mechanism is the constant voice of underlying authors in leading you through these different labyrinths, so that you may actually resolve the things that are ambiguous and unclear, made so deliberately by them.
Yeah, I almost feel like there's like a mystic dimension to it. So which kind of like builds onto my next question, and we can maybe put that together. Is that often the study of logic is characterized as dry and scholastic. How do you think this relates to poetics and emotions?
Yeah, I want to actually, I want to take up your expression about devotional practice. So the content of logic itself, other than, for those of us who get really absorbed into the puzzles and enjoy solving them, can seem and appear to be quite dry and scholastic. It is not an exercise that is visceral in any way. It's true. Other than some jokes you run into here and there by logicians, because they do have a sense of humor, and I can tell you one of them later if we have time that comes to mind. But no, the involvement of the logician, the commentator, in engaging text is actually a devotional practice, and this is a part of learning in the pre-modern age that we tend to forget. The mutton is presented in a number of prolegomena to these texts as something like an oracle. It is often presented not explicitly so, but kind of like the Quran, which is, an ayah. It's a sign, and you're supposed to unpack it, and it's telling you how to unpack it through the various observations and methods and so on, just like a mutton is doing. And the commentator in each layer is something like a hierophant. He is speaking the oracle and presenting what the underlying meanings of the things might be. So in the book, there's a section where I quickly present some quotations from the introductory statements of these commentators about their base text, and commentators upon commentators about their base text. And this seems to be the kind of devotional practice. I've seen commentators, for example, write about, including my grandfather, about um, sending prayers to the authors before beginning the text, and then when they're not able to solve the text, falling asleep, having a conversation with the master who is in the text and constantly speaking to you. And they would come to you in your dream and lead you by the hand. In this case, in the dream recorded by my grandfather in the margin of one of these commentaries on the Sullam, that the author, alhamdulillah, came to him, and he brought the book forward in front of him, and he took him to the page numbers, and he said, tie this comment here on line 3 on page 17 with the comment here on page 12. I'm telling you what the hint is. And then he woke up and he was able to resolve this, right? So there is a devotional exercise here. There's a kind of a sense of involvement in a tradition that is internal. It's being part of a scholarly community that is diachronically continuous. So it is a kind of a devotional practice in that sense. Emotions, if we're speaking specifically about the content of logic, yeah, one can certainly talk about emotions in terms of poetic syllogisms, the aim of which is to do takhil, to make you imagine a thing as something other than itself by virtue of a simile that is created, so that the knowledge you gain out of it is an actionable knowledge, meaning it's not merely knowing the content of a proposition, but feeling a certain way about a thing. Let's say about honey, you may feel disgust for it because it's related in a poetic image through a simile to bile, for example. So a poetic syllogism would deal with those kinds of emotions.
Thank you. So moving from devotional act to this so-called decline, some people argue that commentaries are a indication of decline, or are they a site where logic and philosophies develop actually further?
Again, that's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. I think the question of decline, it's just something I tried to do in the book. The question of decline is predicated on certain assumptions, right? So I think before one asks the questions, certain assumptions about the standards of dynamism and decline have to be posited in the tradition. If a tradition thinks of innovation and growth and progress in terms of new conclusions only, or if it thinks of it as an original author whose words are their copyrighted property, as produced, for example, through the court cases in 18th century England, um, where the words of a person is not only their legacy and their private legacy, but also the legacy of their children through the kinds of profit they can make off those words. If we think about innovation, originality, and genius in those in that sense, then yes, I would say those standards are generally not met by the pre-modern Muslim rationalist disciplines. But there's another set of ways we can think about innovation, right? Economy of argument, showing that there is a proof, a good proof for a particular position that has been excavated, but then there may be other ways of getting and better ways of getting to that conclusion. Or showing that a particular proof, although it is true and it leads to a conclusion, compromises other positions that are held in the system and therefore produces inconsistency or incoherence in the system. So we need some other ways of proving the same argument, for proving the same position. Those kinds of things certainly do occur in the commentarial hair-splitting arguments. Now, sometimes it also happens that those arguments that are meant to lead you to a new conclusion join other parts of the system to produce a new and more robust synthesis for the system. Sometimes it happens that elements of the arguments may have a certain subtle hint or position that itself becomes the subject matter of a new disquisition. That too is dynamic, right? So their interest is not really to produce a new conclusion, but along the way, the method or argument they're using tends to produce either a new problem or a new subject matter, which may lead them a new direction in the future, or it may be jettisoned. Those nobody may pick up those particular hints or positions. So those are also other ways of thinking about dynamism. If a tradition finally aims to produce dynamism by forcing future authors to dig into the past and looking into the past through deeper and deeper textual excavation, through kind of cyclical return, if that's what moving forward means for them, right? To synthesize the tradition throughout, look at the different proofs, patching fragments together to conclude conclude in a more robust way. That too is happening in the commentarial tradition. So I think what we need to do is reimagine what the criteria for dynamism are, and what traditions produces, what tradition produces those criteria. If they're post-enlightenment criteria that involve a solitary genius, copyrights, non-repetition, then no, you will not find that in the commentary. But that is a very specific way of thinking about dynamism.
Thank you so much. I want to move into the conversation to the contemporary or just before the contemporary period. And I want to think about technology, like the print culture, and what impact that might have had, if any, on the commentary production. But also in your book, you talk about how vernacular Urdu, institutionalization of learning, like the madrasa, for example, Deoband, and textualization of learning in place of, I call, orality embedded within the commentarial tradition. I wonder how much of these sort of ideas or these sort of changes or shifts um, impacted upon not just logic or the study of logic, but commentary tradition as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that question ties in well with what we were discussing just a moment before, right? Because the dynamism of the commentary tradition is tied to specific modes of production and in specific institutions of production. So, in the case of logic, for example, the production of print culture, or the use of print culture and the mass distribution of these texts was meant to produce now a readerly culture of commentary. A number of late commentaries, for example, late 19th, early 20th century, written on the Sullam, are actually written for the purpose of print. So they're actually publishers themselves who are also scholars who are producing these commentaries for mere exegesis, generally for making sure that the students comprehend and understand what is happening in the Sullam, but not necessarily engaging it in critique or dialectical space of that sort. So, in a way, print culture is not motivating further writing upon commentary, right? It's a mass distribution of a text. It's serving the purpose partly of profit. It's also happening in an institution that's becoming increasingly rigid and more like a Western institution, right? So, for example, in the pre-modern madrasa tradition, you would have students of all ages, depending on their level and where they are in their training, in the same class. And you would not necessarily read the whole text, you would read parts of a text, enough as led by a master both found within the textual space of your discipline, but also a living master in front of you, guided by them to produce writing. Um, Now, when you become sort of a rigid curriculum and in a madrasa system reflecting a Western institution of the university, then those ways of thinking about a text and its arguments will also disappear, right? So these things are all tied. The print tradition, production of the madrasa in the form of a university, hard and clear curricula, clear sense of progress from one text to the other and one discipline to the other. All of these things are producing a certain kind of stagnation. So, in the case of logic, commentarial exercise becomes actually kind of sterile after this period. The more we get into print culture and the more we get into those madrasas that are more rigid in their curricula, the less we see innovation in the field of logic.
Thank you. The next question is a very pertinent one. It's often debated amongst Muslims who especially been studying in madrasa tradition, but also people who are studying at universities. Um, I would like to ask if you could say something about Islamic philosophy and logic, um, for Islamic philosophy and logic today, or learning of it today, and its relevance. I mean, for example, in the madrasa tradition, many madrasa traditions, it's been severely watered down, both subjects. But also in universities, unless you're doing a specialism, um, a lot of people are not really learning logic, or they're not really engaging with subjects in a philosophical way. It's more functional. It's more about just studying the subject itself. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, and that is, I think, a great loss to the tradition. And the reason for that is that after Avicenna, Islamic theology and legal theory, at least, not to mention balagha and various other disciplines, are heavily informed by the philosophical apparatus and by logic in particular, right? So, I, for example, recently finished an article on Qarafi's reception of Razi's Mahsul on definitions of usul al-fiqh, and the way the questions that are being raised by Qarafi and that are being raised by Razi in the field of usul, in the definition of what usul al-fiqh is, are informed by various modes of thinking about epistemology that are found in falsafa. So if you're going to do Islamically, if you're going to do usul al-fiqh, you have to have familiarity with theories of knowledge, for example, of ilm, because that's what they're grappling with. And they're taking it as a synthesized and an organic body of arguments into the fields like usul al-fiqh. And similarly, various arguments found in fiqh and usul al-fiqh actually fall back on modes of disputation theory that are found in adab al-bahth, which is closely related to mantiq, for example. So it is, if one is going to do serious and in-depth internal critical work in a range of disciplines within Islamic studies, one cannot jettison philosophy and logic and related disciplines, the maqulat, because they were just so deeply integrated into these other disciplines that appear to be more important in the contemporary age, that one would not be able to do full justice to the reading of these disciplines. So that's what I would have to say about it. Unfortunately, yeah, in the Sunni world, especially, much less in Iran, in the Shia world, Iran and Iraq, in the Sunni world especially, there has been an unfortunate decline in the interest in these disciplines, and it's a great injustice to the integrity of the tradition and our ability to read it on its own terms. So that's I think my bit of a concern about where we are.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, for example, I've trained in the Hanafi legal tradition, and when you read the furu, the rulings, it's very clear that to make sense of them and take them back to their principles, it requires a lot of reasoning skills, debating skills, jadal. But without all of that, it's very difficult. Otherwise, the rulings just seem very abstract
Yeah.
and there's no coherence. But there is actually a deep coherence, rationality, and that brings all of that together. So yeah, I definitely found that experience in my own journey as well. Um, Here's an important question: How do we? So we have this Islamic intellectual tradition, the Turas of the past. How do we bring that into conversation, into academia into the West? Can we even do that? Is it that we can't do it? Is it that we can? So how do we bring this to life? That's my next question.
That is something on which I have a very clear position. I don't know if I know my Berkeley colleagues agree with this, with which I'm very happy. And well, let's see. My position, generally speaking, is that traditions speaking to each other often, that fact often presupposes certain hierarchy of authority. So what I find problematic would be if we have read a lot of theories produced by Western scholars, um, digested them, and then think about the Islamic tradition and its text through those theories. That is a kind of a textual violence that deforms a tradition. What I think needs to be done to bring the two, or any culture, set of cultures, into conversation is to read deeply the texts of any given culture and tradition, and from those texts to extract a theory that would be relevant for reading those texts. So I try to do that, for example, in the Sullam al-ʿulūm reading of mine, because the middle chapters are a theory of commentary, which are not informed by commentarial theories relevant to the Western textual traditions, right? Um, and so once those theories are brought forward on the terms of the text themselves, then on their own footing, they should be and must be, I think, put into conversation with existing theories that claim universality, but they're not universal. They're specific to certain moments and periods of production and certain texts. That's when you can have a meaningful and non-hierarchical dialogue. And in fact, in that case, once that happens, I think both sides can inform each other and modulate each other, de-universalize each other, and so on. So I do that kind of exercise to some extent in the footnotes. I'm very careful in my book not to bring my theories openly into conversation with authors like Genet, for example, and others who have written about commentary. They're in the footnotes, and I often say, well, this is a particular theory brought forward by Compagnon, for example, but what I see from my text is that this is really how commentaries are working, and so let's see, where we can modulate and use either a theory for a large study or a larger set of texts and study. So that would be my approach of the integration or conversation that needs to happen among different traditions. That's how I would go
Thank
about
you
it.
so much. Yeah, that's really useful. So we're coming to the end. We've come to the end, but there was one question that I have to ask you, and you mentioned it while we were speaking, that um, people who write about philosophy and logic do have a sense of humor. And you mentioned that you might have an example that to share with us. And we just, this is a way of ending on a positive note. So I wonder if you could share perhaps something that our viewers could maybe walk away with and think logic is something that's very, very fascinating and also perhaps a little bit funny as well.
Well, I don't know if it's fascinating. I found it funny because you're right. When you're reading text and logic, you're really in the depths of technical arguments, right? So you're talking about
Mm.
propositional semantics and how those basic rules of logic may be violated when you grant one principle, another principle appears to be violated. So how do you solve the problem? So anyway, there is a little fragment I ran into not too long ago. Um, and I actually sent it to my students as a few line, and I don't have it on desktop, but the argument pertains to the discussion of universals and how they relate to each other, right? So it's a heavy, serious discussion. And two of the ways in which universals relate to each other is either through a relationship of complete encompassing, right? So every man is an animal, man is a universal, animal is a universal. So you can imagine a diagram where you have man as a small circle and animal as a large circle, right? Or another way in which they might relate, for example, would be through overlap, like a Venn diagram, right?
Mhm.
Um, uh, so, for example, I guess animal and whiteness would belong in a Venn diagram. Not everything that is white is an animal, and not every animal is white, but they do overlap. There's some animals who are white and some white things who are
Yeah.
animals. So, in that case, the author was talking about uh, cases of universals that never overlap, and the joining of those universals would actually lead to a concept that is impossible, right? Because they're interested in
Mm.
claims about impossible things, which is also a fascinating topic. So he says, for example, a human being and a donkey stand in that kind of a relationship of tabayun. And then he says, except that I'm not sure that's entirely true, because in our day and age, there is an overlap between humans and donkeys,
donkeys.
fools.
Right.
So anyway, I thought you don't find that kind of stuff very often. So it's a little put down on his age, and I don't know about whom he's thinking at that point.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a little silly thing that occurs in the text.
Yeah. Maybe he has someone he doesn't really like, and he was thinking about that person at that
Yeah, I
time,
mean,
at that moment.
sometimes it can be quite cruel, and in fact, they do use, as sophisticated and brilliant as these people are, sometimes they actually use some harsh words about people without naming them, and you know who they're talking about. But anyway, so
Yeah. No, so thank you so much, Professor, for that joyful journey with Islamic philosophy and logic. I'm sure we could have talked a lot longer and discussed a lot more, but we have to stick to some sort of time limit as well. We hope that our viewers and listeners can join us for more on the Legacies of Learning project, this particular podcast, where we explore the Islamic intellectual tradition to ask questions about how our rich legacy can help us today, which is something that we're really, really focusing on, reviving our Torah, reviving our tradition. So please do subscribe to our channel. Please do join us on our mailing list. And please do leave some comments and reflections behind. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you very much, Professor Asad.
it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
To find out more about this exciting project, you can visit the Legacies of Learning webpage by scanning the QR code at the end of this video or through the link in the description below.